Here we'll look at solving quadratic equations. And while there's going to be many ways to do this, right now we'll concentrate on just two. So first, what exactly is a quadratic equation? Well, quadratic means we have something like x squared, and equation just means we have an equal sign. Something like this is a quadratic equation. X squared plus 8x plus 12 equal to 0. And the first thing we're going to do is do our factoring principle. And essentially what we need to realize is that if I have two numbers that multiply and we know the answer is 0, one of those had to be 0 in the first place. So if we try to factor this, two numbers that multiply to be 12 and add to be 8 would be 6 and 2. So now on the left I have two things that are being multiplied and I know that they're equal to 0. Therefore, one of them has to be 0. So either x plus 6 is 0 or x plus 2 is 0, which gives us negative 6 or negative 2. So we have two answers. So now let's do a few more examples. Here, x squared minus 11x plus 19 equal to negative 5. So it's first important to realize that when we factor, we do need this thing to be equal to 0. If two numbers multiply to be negative 5, I can't guarantee that one of them is negative 5. It could be, but one of them could also be 1/2, and the other one could be negative 10. So we don't really know. So instead we're going to have to get the negative 5 to the other side. So when we add it to both sides, 19 plus 5 is going to be 24, equal to 0. And then we can factor. We need two numbers that multiply to be 24 and add to be negative 11. And we can see that we get that with negative 3 times negative 8, which would be positive 24, and negative 3 minus 8 is negative 11. So x minus 3 is 0, and x minus 8 is 0, which gives us our two answers, 3 and 8. Our next example, x squared plus 3x minus 12 equal to 6. Our first step is going to be to get the 6 on the other side because we do need it to be equal to 0. So subtracting 6 from both sides gives us a negative 18 on the left and a 0 on the right. We now need two numbers that multiply to be negative 18 and add to be 3. So we can try to think of what would give us this, but if we do a positive 6 and a negative 3, we know that 6 times negative 3 is negative 18, and 6 minus 3 is positive 3. So we have x plus 6 is 0, and x minus 3 is equal to 0. This gives us negative 6 and positive 3 as our two answers. Next, let's look at this equation, x squared equal to 4. Well, we could subtract the 4 to the other side like we have been doing in factor, but we can also think about what squared is 4. Well, in order to undo a square root, or in order to undo a square, we would do a square root. And we know the square root of 4 is 2. However, is this the only answer? And the answer is no. While 2 squared is equal to 4, negative 2 squared is also equal to 4. So when we take the square root, we lose this identity of signs. So instead, whenever we take the square root of both sides, in general, if I have x squared equal to a, we'll take plus and minus the square root. So we're also allowed to just take the square root of both sides. Here, x minus 8 squared equal to 9. While this doesn't look exactly like our last example, it is still essentially the same thing. I have something squared on the left and a number on the right, so we can take the square root. I would now have x minus 8 on the left and positive or negative square root of 9 on the right, which we know is plus or minus 3. We now want to move the 8 to the other side so I can add 8 to both sides, and now I have x equal to 8 plus or minus 3. Well, 8 plus 3 is 11, and 8 minus 3 is 5. So I have my two answers, 11 and 5. One more. Once again, we have something squared on the left and a number on the right, so let's take the square root. On the left, I get x plus 2. On the right, plus or minus the square root of 7. In the previous examples, we were actually able to take this square root, but we can't do that here. But that's okay. I can now just subtract 2 from both sides, and I have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 7. So I do still have two answers, negative 2 plus root 7 and negative 2 minus root 7. They're not as nice of answers as we've been dealing with, but they're perfectly legitimate numbers, and they do actually work.